Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who will give our keynote address entitled The Intersection of Domestic Violence and Child Abuse. Our speaker is Elizabeth Wessels Martin. And thank you so much for being here today. Elizabeth is the President and Chief Empowerment Officer for the Center for Women and Families. She has an extensive career history in senior management, developing programs and expanding services to meet the needs of children and families who've suffered trauma related to violence, oppression, racism, and poverty throughout the state of Kentucky. She's a longtime resident of Louisville and a graduate from the Kent School of Social Work at University of Louisville, where she earned her master's in social work. She has held leadership positions at Bellwood, the Brookline Child and Family Services, Sunrise Children's Services, and Hospice Health. Elizabeth is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in women's issues and trauma work with adults and children. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's an honor to be here and to be with so many amazing people in the work that you do in the field of pediatrics. As Kelly said, I have a long history in child welfare, so kids are very dear and near to my heart. And, you know, it couldn't be a better time to have this conversation since October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and highlighting both domestic violence and child abuse and how the two very much go hand in hand. So again, thank you so much. I will go ahead and start. Kelly, I know McKenna, we brought my presentation up. Do I need to reshare my screen?
Yes.
Well, we're having technical issues again.
Let us know if you want me to share it, and I can share for you if you need.
Okay, can you?
We can see the notes. So if you go back up to that display settings and swap.
There we go.
Perfect.
That's what happens when you have multiple monitors. All right. So today's learning objectives are going to be knowing the forms of domestic intimate partner violence. Obviously, don't expect you to be an expert when we finish this, but definitely having some good understanding of what domestic intimate partner violence looks like. And we use those terms interchangeably because we know that it's just not married individuals. With the increase of people cohabitating together, long-term relationships in which they have children, we use those terms interchangeably. Understanding the prevalence of domestic intimate partner violence nationally, but also locally. And I'll give you some pretty astounding statistics about that. Realizing the prevalence of co-occurrence of domestic violence and child abuse. Know the shared characteristics of domestic violence and child abuse. Learn how children experience domestic violence. Even though they may not be direct victims of physical violence, they definitely experience it and the trauma that they carry with them for a lifetime. Understand how exposure to domestic violence can impact a child in their development, and then discover strategies for assessing and preventing child maltreatment in an abusive relationship. So some US statistics. 10 million people are impacted by family and domestic violence each year. And unfortunately, we're seeing that growing. 20 people are assaulted every 20 minutes by their partner. And just remember that domestic violence sits adjacent to so many other problems that we see in society. As we grapple with education, economics, mental and physical health, crime and gender, and racial equity. Also, those who have been actively involved in prison reform will often butt up against domestic violence over and over as perpetrators go to jail, get little or no treatment because there's not treatment in the jail, in prison for domestic violence, and then they return to civilian society and repeat the cycle. We also know that domestic violence, health and medical costs top more than $8 billion each year for taxpayers, and cause victims to lose more than 8 million workdays each year. We also know that domestic violence, and especially here in Louisville, is the #1 cause for women being homeless. And so we see a growing number of women being homeless. And unfortunately, when they're homeless, so are their children. This is a pretty astounding statistic. From 2000 to 2006, 3,200 American soldiers were killed during that same period in combat. If you think about those times in which we were actively involved in wars, we lost 3,200 American soldiers in those 6 years. And that same time span, 10,600 people were killed as a result of domestic violence in the United States. Locally in our community, 2 in every 5 women will experience intimate partner violence, excuse me, at some time during their life. 1 in 3 men. I get a lot of questions asked, do you take men? Absolutely. We are looking at rebranding. We know that our name is a misnomer. We absolutely take men. We take anybody and everybody who is a victim of domestic sexual violence. 2 in every 5 women in Indiana and 1 in every 4 men experience intimate partner at some time in their lifetime. And both of those are higher than the national average. To date, so the Center for Women and Families serves 9 counties. We serve the 7 surrounding counties. So we serve Jefferson, Bullitt, Oldham, Henry, Spencer, Trimble, and Shelby. And then we also have services in Clark and Floyd County. And so in those 9 counties, to date, we have had 20 domestic violence related homicides. And that 20 does include the unborn child of Dariana Jones, who was murdered this summer. Domestic violence makes up 15% of all violence in our community. So as you think about and hear the numbers of homicides that have occurred in our city, just remember that 15% of those are domestic violence related. I want to go over a little bit of what is the definition of domestic intimate partner violence. As I said, it is sometimes called intimate partner violence. And another reason we use that term, and you're going to hear that even more frequently, is in 2016, Kentucky finally passed the law called the IPO law, which means we've had for quite a long time where victims of domestic violence have been able to pursue an emergency protective order. But that was only set up for if you were married. In 2016, Kentucky passed a law in which you can now, if you are in a cohabitating relationship, long-term relationship, you can provide evidence that you have been in that relationship for a long time. You share the same address. You have a joint checkbook. They'll even ask you, are his clothes at your apartment? Is his toothbrush at your home? You can now get an intimate partner protective order. We will oftentimes refer to it as IPO. It includes physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, as well as sexual coercion and stalking by a current or former intimate partner. An intimate partner is a person with whom you have had a close personal or sexual relationship. Intimate partner violence affects millions of women each year. And of course, as people are not getting married, but staying in these long-term relationships, we are seeing an increase in intimate partner violence that often does involve children. Types of abuse. This is something that we talk a lot about at the center because people, unfortunately, often when they think of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, they think of physical. It is so much more than that. Yes, it is physical. So it's hitting, slapping, strangulation. 2 years ago, the strangulation law passed in Kentucky, which it is now a felony. Thank you to Julie Rocky Adams. She really pushed that bill through for us and for not for us, but for survivors and for those of us who serve those individuals. Regarding physical abuse, we know that if a perpetrator has access to a gun, the victim is 5 times more likely to die. Gun violence is the #1 way that victims die. Verbal abuse, name calling, yelling, screaming, raging. Those are all forms of verbal abuse. Sexual abuse, rape, sexual coercion. Heard some pretty horrific stories about that. And unfortunately, we're having to have some tough conversations around rape and sexual violence as it pertains to unwanted pregnancies. Financial abuse, not allowing the victim to work, keeping money from them, holding credit cards, giving them zero access to money. I recently talked to a woman whose mother was dying in the hospital, and she had to ask her husband, who was physically and mentally had been abusing her for years, if she could have enough money to get gas to go see her dying mother. She had lived in such an incredible prison that she didn't have a car, she had no way to leave, and she didn't have access to any money whatsoever. And we often see that in domestic violence relationships. Psychological abuse. And victims will tell you that the psychological abuse they experience in these relationships is so much more than the physical, because those are the things that tear down who they are as a human being and have extreme difficulty healing from, and being able to, close those tapes and not be able to hear them anymore. Psychological abuse, accusations of cheating and other signs of jealousy and possessiveness, tracking someone, the length that perpetrators will go to track their victim is amazing to me. I recently was working with a woman who she couldn't understand. She had turned off her cell phone tracking device, but she couldn't understand how her husband continued to find everywhere she was. And what she discovered was that in their car, he had bought several cell phones, and in two of their cars, he had turned on the tracking device and he had hid them under the seats. And she didn't know till she dropped a piece of something and she went down to pick it up and realized there were cell phones under her seat. And that's how he had been tracking her and showing up at workplaces and showing up when she was going out with friends. So he had gone to some pretty extreme, and that's not uncommon. Constant criticism, gaslighting, definitely an increase in gaslighting with the increase in technology. We see situations where spouses at work, and through all of the electronic, the Alexa, turning, your heat and your air, opening your garage door, turning your lights on and off, they are able to start just really manipulating and getting the victim to doubt themselves. Isolating from friends and family, and intimidation. Factors that often put individuals at a little bit of a higher risk to become domestic violence survivors and unfortunately victims. Race. We know that women of color are 4 times more likely to be in a domestic violence relationship. Immigration status is a big factor. We work with a number of organizations around the city, and we also have immigration advocates. We call our staff advocates, and because we serve a number of individuals who are either here and they are here legally, so they have all of their documentation, but we also serve individuals who are not. They have been mail order brides. They've come to this country thinking something positive is going to happen. They end up marrying a US citizen and have a child, and often their immigration status is used as a weapon against them. If you tell what I'm doing to you, I will report you, you'll get deported, and you'll never see this child again. I worked with a woman who was just in that situation. Education level. We know that those who have not completed higher level of education often do not have access to resources and may not have some of the skill sets to be able to make those critical decisions to be able to leave. Access to resources. Those that we serve here at the center directly, those who have accessed our 24/7 emergency crisis shelter, often don't have access to resources. If you have money, you might be able to pay for a hotel or go move into another apartment or relocate. But if you don't have those, then you're going to depend on what can the community provide for you. Support system is extremely important. I think many of you know by now, Dawn G is very public that she is a survivor of domestic violence. And one of the things that was very important to her was that she had a strong support system. The day that she announced that she was leaving her abusive husband, her family pulled up in a U-Haul truck, loaded her up, and moved her out. Alcohol or drug use is a big factor, not only with the perpetrator, but with the survivor. A lot of self-medicating, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into the presentation. But we definitely see a lot of drug and alcohol use, both with survivors and with the perpetrators. Behavioral health symptoms and diagnosis. We know that individuals who have co-occurring disorders, bipolar, depression, anxiety, other they have a mental health DSM diagnosis, often will find themselves in an abusive situation. And generational trauma. One of the things that I asked not long after I came into this position over 4.5 years ago to the staff that had been here for a long time is, how often do you see the adults that are coming in now, did you know them as children? And they say yes. So we know that generational trauma is a huge factor. We oftentimes will repeat what we know if we've not gotten the help to be able to break that cycle. We see a lot of especially young ladies who come to us who grew up in the foster care system and they aged out, found themselves in a bad situation, got pregnant, and they reach out to us for help. So the impact of intimate partner and sexual violence. Children are particularly vulnerable, and you all know that, as both victims and witnesses. Approximately 15 million children live in homes where family violence occurs. Long-lasting and chronic permanent effects of intimate partner sexual violence, and often these go undiagnosed. It's something where I'm having some conversation with some Jefferson County legislatures, is PTSD, huge factor with individuals. There's some research out there that's being done, and a little bit has been published comparing domestic violence survivors who have PTSD to, again, combat soldiers. Very similar behaviors, very similar symptoms. Traumatic brain injury, something that often goes undiagnosed. When a domestic violence survivor goes to the emergency room because of an injury, typically what's treated is the injury that's seen. There's not enough screening that occurs to start talking about traumatic brain injuries. We see that here at the shelter. We see the symptoms with that, and of course, more injuries. A study shows that the lifetime economic cost of intimate partner violence to the U.S. population is $3.6 trillion, and rape is the costliest crime to its victims. So I want to give you a glimpse of what the center sees. So in fiscal year 22, our fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. So in the last fiscal year, we took 3,975 domestic violence related crisis calls. Our crisis line is our front line of service. We tell everybody to call no matter what, and we're open 24/7. We never close. We didn't close through COVID. We don't ever close. So we take calls 24/7. So we took almost 4,000 domestic violence related calls from the 9-county area. Last fiscal year, we served 290 adults in our emergency shelter. We have 79 beds, and that's literally 79 individuals that we can serve. That's our maximum capacity. And we served 167 children. So out of the 290 people that we served, or the 290 adults, 167 were also children. So that gives you some idea of the amount of impact. So every one of these 167 children that we served witnessed abuse, very likely were victims of abuse. Because one of the things I want to highlight is those that we serve in shelter, because we only have limited space, come in and screened in as high lethality, meaning that they are fleeing very lethal abuse at that moment. And if they stay in that situation, they will likely be killed. So these kids witnessed a tremendous amount of violence. We are a mandated reporter, of course. And so we make child protective service calls as well. We made, in fiscal year last year, we made 91. So again, on the crisis response call line, we made 79. And what that looks like is, if we have someone calling and telling us about their situation, as we do safety planning, they have shared with us either physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, some form of abuse that falls under the mandated reporting law definition of child abuse. And we oftentimes, the way that we handle that with the caller is we say to them, okay, you have just shared with me that your child is being abused by the perpetrator or whoever they just shared with. I need to report that. You know, you are more than welcome to stay on the line with me while I make that report, but you don't have to. It's not often that they stay on the line, but they know that we have to make that report. Our non-residential domestic violence services made one report Our emergency shelter made 7. And typically what that is, when those 7, it means we have actually witnessed a form of child abuse here in shelter, perpetrated by their caregiver, unfortunately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The legal justice team that works in the court made 1 report, sexual assault services made 1, and our Southern Indiana made 2. I reached out to the child abuse hotline because I wanted to see what they were also seeing from Kentucky and Indiana. And I won't go over these, it's a lot of material, but I wanted you to see the child abuse hotline, of course, receives calls via text, chats, and telephone calls. And you can see the numbers and how they're broken down and who made the call. I just, again, it's very astonishing to me. So 622 calls in Kentucky and 633 calls in Indiana were made to the child abuse hotline. So let's talk a little bit about the child maltreatment that we see as the intersection between domestic violence and child abuse. So if, as we know, it frequently co-occurs, both forms of abuse share very, very common characteristics. If one form of abuse is suspected or known, the family should be assessed for the other. And when I get into talking about prevention strategies, I will share a little bit about some of the models that are out in the country that are doing that form of assessment. Studies measuring co-occurrence of child maltreatment typically find that 30 to 60% of families experience one form of abuse, also experience the other. One nationally representative study in 2006 estimated that as I already said, 15 million children live in domestic violence situations. 7 million children live in families, excuse me, live in families in which severe partner violence has occurred. According to the Family Violence Institute in Arizona, since 2000, the U.S. has seen a steady increase in familial homicide, in which both the victim was killed as well as the child was murdered by the perpetrator. There were 67 cases in 2000. In 2013, there was 163, and they see that number climbing. There's some shared characteristics of domestic violence and child abuse. Power and control. Domestic violence is about power and control. That's what it's about, is I am going to control you. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to exude power over you in any way I possibly can. It's the same thing for rape. That's what it's about. It's about power and control. And perpetrators often, in their power and control, threaten to report the victim to Child Protective Services for injuries that have occurred to the child. I will blame you. You already have a case open. CPS has already made calls. I will report you. You'll never see these children again. Threaten to take custody of the children. That is a very common threat. And we see that more in our higher level socioeconomic families where there are means to do that. I know of a situation, an extremely, extremely wealthy family where the wife had experienced tremendous emotional, psychological, and physical violence for years. Felt very stuck. She had not worked. She was completely dependent upon her husband. And he told her, if you leave, you will never see these children again. I will make certain of that. People know you're crazy. They'll never believe you. Threaten to harm themselves to control their victims. We see that a lot here in shelter. We have a lot of our clients that we serve in shelter who get text messages from their perpetrator who again say, if you don't come back to me, I'm going to kill myself. Very graphic details. Stalking their victims, extremely common. Again, if they can track the victim's location, they're going to stalk. In some situations, I have seen perpetrators quit their jobs to make their full-time job stalking their victim, to know every single move that they make. Harm the child to hurt the other parent, particularly when separation has occurred or is imminent. If you were at our event on Wednesday, you heard an amazing woman speak about her domestic violence that she experienced One of the things that she didn't talk about is that she has recently been involved in court because her profoundly autistic child that she had with this man came back to her recently with unexplained bruises and scratches that he could not have gotten on his own. She immediately took him to Norton Emergency Room, got an assessment done. They did determine that the injuries were a result of child maltreatment. And fortunately, she has full custody of this child. But that is not uncommon. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that when a survivor of domestic violence takes out an EPO and is granted an EPO, that EPO is just for them. It is not for the children. You have to provide to the court that there is that the child is at risk by this same perpetrator in order to get an emergency protective order for that child as well. And so oftentimes what happens is, because that hasn't happened, now you've got the survivor and the perpetrator are having to co-parent, which is extremely difficult. We do a lot of work with women and men who are having to co-parent with their abuser and helping them understand how to navigate that as the children have to go back and forth. It is very traumatic. And they use the child's behavior as an excuse to be abusive. We sometimes see that here at the shelter, is that the children, especially as they come here and they start to feel safe, they start to act out. That's understandable. Working with kids, that's what we see over and over. It's their trauma. It's the recreating of the trauma, and just for the first time being safe enough that I can experience that and show that. But unfortunately, what we find not only with perpetrators, but with a non-offending parent, is that can lead to bad choices. Perpetrators become angry and abusive children when the perpetrator feels the victim is paying more attention to the children. Worked with a woman who husband was extremely abusive to everyone, and he would lock his wife in a room, rape her, leave her locked in the room, and then come out and abuse the children because they weren't behaving. Require the kids to pay more attention to his or her needs for fears of consequences. You need to pay more attention to your father, really redirecting so that in order to keep the abuse at bay. Restrict accesses to finance or transportation. Prevent the victim from getting any medical attention for the injured child. Don't send the child to school. Don't take him to the doctor. I'm not going to allow you to do that. You can't take the car. You don't have money to do that. And prevent the victim from otherwise meeting children's basic needs: food, education, medical care, the things that kids need, and preventing them from doing that. Shared characteristics. Victims may be unlikely to disclose abuse for the following. As we've said, they're afraid. They're so afraid. Parents, as we all are, if you have children, you're terrified of losing your kids. And the brainwashing has gone on for so long. And perpetrators know that the one weapon that is the most precious is these children. And so if I can threaten in any way that you're going to lose these kids to maintain power and control of you, I'm going to do that. Fear of being blamed. We know that when we compare our statistics to LMPDs, we get more calls than they do. And the reason is, and we've had these discussions with LMPD, is there is some fear. I mean, sometimes survivors have a warrant for their arrest. Sometimes they're actively using alcohol and drugs. They're also afraid of their abuser being arrested, but they're afraid of being blamed because, again, nobody's going to believe you. This is your fault. If you would do this, this, and this wouldn't happen. And so they truly believe that. May be concerned about overreaction or minimization of the problem. Who's going to believe me? He said nobody would believe me. Will anybody believe me? Feel responsible and guilty or embarrassed for the abuse. That's why we say we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it loudly because victims are not responsible. With child maltreatment and domestic violence, it's difficult to prove that a perpetrator will not abuse again in the future. There's no evidence that supports that because, unfortunately, there's very few batterer intervention programs in our country, and they are not regulated at all. We're having some conversations about that in regards to the programs here in Louisville. How children experience domestic violence. Every child that I ever worked with at Brookline and Bellwood, I can't think of a single child that did not come from a home where family violence was occurring on a regular basis. Children may be the direct targets of physical or verbal abuse. And in some situations, and I didn't list this on here, but in some situations, we also know they can become the targets of sexual abuse, especially as they age and go through puberty. Be subject to frequent moves. A lot of domestic violence survivors, intimate partner survivors, are often live a very transient lifestyle. They're couch surfing. They're going from friend to family. They're going to shelters. We have people that come here. We have people that live on the streets. Up for Women sends a lot of folks here. Sometimes we have to relocate families. We recently relocated a family of 5 to South Carolina, and only was a Latinx family, and only 2 of the older children spoke English. Mom did not, and none of the other children spoke English. Be forced into participating in the adult's abuse and degradation. Worked with a family, in a wealthy family, in which the perpetrator, which was the father, the husband, had brainwashed the children to see mom as it was all her fault. And what she was experiencing, especially from the oldest son, was the same type of verbal abuse that she was getting from her husband. Trying to intervene in suffering injury. We know that in Angelica James's case, she was a woman that was murdered back in the spring, late winter, in which her oldest son was also shot by the perpetrator, Christopher Gordon. He was trying to intervene. Again, we see that a lot, especially in boys and older boys, teenage boys, where they're trying to protect the victim, and they often get injured themselves. They also become parentified. They take on the other role as the parent, especially if they have been left to be responsible for their younger siblings, which is incredibly frequent. We see that here at the shelter. Mom wants to leave the oldest child responsible for the younger kids, and we say very rarely, no, you cannot do that. And what we find is that was done on a regular basis at home. Children, of course, overhear the verbal abuse, screams, and pleas for help. There's story after story after story of you hear kids. I worked with a couple of churches down in the Dumanel area, and one of the pastors talked about he remembers he and his brother sitting in their beds in the basement with their hands over their ears because they could hear the abuse and how horrific, and unfortunately it still plagues them today. Children may witness. They witness the perpetrator being arrested. And so again, as we know, even children that are abused, they still have a bond to that abusive parent. We know that that bond is incredibly tight. And so it's very traumatic to see that person to be arrested. They see the victim's physical injuries and bruises, and they see the victim taken away by the hospital, by the ambulance. It's incredibly traumatic. Children are more likely to be exposed to substance abuse. The rate of domestic violence survivors and substance abuse is incredibly high. We've seen a drastic increase of that here at the center over the last several years. We know that perpetrators who abuse alcohol are more likely to severely abuse their partners. We saw a drastic increase of this during COVID. If you think about what shut down during COVID and what didn't, so liquor stores did not close during COVID. Access to guns were extremely high during COVID. And then you put all of those factors together, people losing their jobs, they're drinking more, they have access to weapons, they're not working, and now they're stuck at home. It created for a very lethal combination. Unfortunately, victims do use substances to self-medicate due to the physical, emotional pain. They have learned that if I can smoke some marijuana, or if I can use some meth or heroin or whatever their drug of choice, or use alcohol as a way to stop the physical pain, but also the symptoms from the PTSD, I can function. We've had to make some reports regarding that because obviously that's not appropriate. You can't parent when you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The impact of domestic violence on children, the direct impact. As we said, they suffer physical injuries as the targets. They inadvertently be injured. We see that, I'm sure you all have seen that with babies. Mom's holding the baby or dad is holding the baby. We had a dad here with 3 little boys not too long ago. Mom, wife had become addicted to heroin and was very physically aggressive with the father. And as he was holding the youngest child, which I think was 6 months old, the baby was injured as she was swinging something. I'm not sure what it was, and CPS got involved. Adult domestic violence may over discipline their children. Again, we see that here as children begin to behave like children and maybe even begin to act out some of the trauma that they have experienced. We will see parents here become very rigid with them, yelling, putting them in timeout for long periods of time, withholding things from them, and we intervene and get services to them. Perpetrators may severely be controlling of the children and are likely to use harsh forms of discipline. And then the impact on parenting. The adult's physical injuries can prevent the children from getting adequate care, especially if there's a traumatic brain injury or some form. We had a woman here who was very violently abused by her spouse and had her leg broken in multiple places. And she was in a wheelchair and she just was not able to provide adequate care to her children. Luckily, there was a family member that could take them because she was not going to be able to take care of them here at the center. Victims suffer from depression and anxiety. Absolutely. And it hinders their care. A lot of sleeping. We see a lot of parents doing an incredible amount of sleeping when they get here, and we have to address that with them. Kids still have to go to school when they're here. They are part of the Jefferson County homeless school population. So they still have to get them up, get them to the bus stop. And we see a lot of parents really struggle with that. The adult victim is prevented from getting medical attention for being sick or injured. COVID was not only a huge factor in creating lethal situations in the home, but COVID was also used as a weapon to control victims, such as if you get COVID and come in here, I won't get you help and you'll die. If you go out, you're going to get COVID. And if you bring it back in here, if it doesn't kill you, I'll kill you. And just all sorts of horrible things that victims were told in regards to COVID. Perpetrators' entitlement issues can often lead to neglect. Parent refuses to let children eat. They refuse to let children to go anywhere because their needs come first. You know, again, perpetrators, control, power. This is about me. These are about my needs. They focus on controlling the adult victim and neglect the child's needs. And children get neglected because of substance abuse. Their impact on development. Children express fear, shame, or guilt after disclosing and are likely to feel isolated. It's very difficult for children to tell what's happening at home, as we know. They're very afraid. They feel responsible for that. You know, they don't want to get dad in trouble. They don't want something to happen, especially if they've heard things like, if you tell anybody, you know, they overhear dad yelling at mom, if you tell anybody, the kids will go to foster care and we'll never see him again. Children hear that. Children hear everything. And so we have to always remember that. Children may develop aggressive and antisocial behaviors. We absolutely know that. Low self-esteem and depression. They have fewer social skills, such as relationship forming, and definitely healthy relationship forming and coping skills. They are more likely to recreate the abusive relationship. We know that primarily the research has showed that boys who grew up in domestic violence relationships will often do the same thing. That's what they relate to. They don't know that it's not normal. They don't know that this isn't the way that you treat your partner. And girls, unfortunately, will fall into those abusive relationships because, again, that's what they've seen. I recently heard a family member refer to their mother's murder by their father. She said it wasn't domestic violence, it was a crime of passion. She truly believes dad loved mom so much that he killed her out of a crime of passion. It's very incredibly sad to hear. One study found that child abuse and neglect increases the likelihood juveniles by 59%, as an adult by 28%, and for a violent crime by 30%, they are likely to be arrested. If you took a survey of the kids that are currently in residential places and or sitting in juvenile detention facilities, I would tend to bet that almost 90% of them have come from homes where family violence has occurred. All right, let's talk about strategies of prevention. There's some amazing programs out there, and we are starting to have some conversation here in Louisville. So removing the child from the home should be considered the last resort. Helping the abused parent receive appropriate services and protection is essential. Taking the kids away is not going, yes, you're going to put them in foster care. And those of us who've worked in the child welfare system know that is not what's best for children in majority of the cases. I'm not saying in all, but in oftentimes. If we can bring services into this home and keep hold perpetrators accountable, that's the key. And that's what we really, really struggle, especially in our community, to do. So often, what I hear is that perpetrators are put on home incarceration. Again, a perpetrator is abuse is about power and control. And if their goal is to get to their victim, they don't care that they're on home incarceration. I got a call just Monday of a woman with 4 children. Perpetrator continues to come to her house. He continues to be abusive and he's on home incarceration. Nothing's being done. We've got to hold perpetrators accountable. We've got to get services in and keep families together with the offending parent being out. Research shows that when the perpetrator is not in the home, children fare a lot better. Then the first step for assisting families is recognizing the abuse. Not only the child abuse, but the domestic violence. Those conversations have got to go hand in hand. An assessment is critical and should be done often. Abuse, yes, as I said, we know it is physical or emotional, but there are so many more physical signs that abuse is occurring that we need to take a look at. These are some of the strategies for prevention. Again, one of the things that we do with all victims when they call is we do safety planning, and we safety plan over and over and over, sometimes for the same individuals because their circumstances have changed. We provide individual and group counseling. We, of course, have specialized assessment services. We not only assess what's called the lethality assessment program. It is a program that was brought here to Louisville in 2012 by the Mary Byron Project. It's an evidence-based model out of Baltimore, Maryland. Both LMPD and the center do lethality assessments. So it's 13 questions, including questions about the children that and depending upon how the score is, these questions are ranked and they're weighted a little bit different. The ones around guns and threats to kill people in the home weighted a little bit heavier. And so depending upon the score, it will determine whether that family is in a lethal situation. And if they are, LMPD's job is to say, can I take you to the Center for Women and Families? If they say no, can I connect you? And we try to make that phone connection and talk about resources. And again, oftentimes in those situations, the perpetrator has not been caught. Sometimes that can take days. Sometimes it can take, I've seen it take weeks. We also assess for sex trafficking and human trafficking as well. And again, oftentimes we see children in those situations. We had a woman here who was had been in a sex trafficking ring for quite some time and had 2 small children. Legal advocacy, medical, shelter, and mental health and substance abuse. And then children, we also do safety planning. We have those conversations openly and honestly with children. What should they do if dad or mom's boyfriend or mom or dad's girlfriend or same-sex partners? Because again, we serve people, everyone. We serve people who identify as part of the LGBTQA community. And then the batterer intervention programs, compliance with probation, parenting programs, abuse intervention, safe visitation. We're in some conversations right now about a visitation center and fatherhood programs, and hopefully getting help for their mental health and substance abuse. Coordinated community response is essential. We have to work together. We continue to have conversation. Under the mayor's ordinance, there is a Domestic Violence Prevention Coordinating Council in which the center has a seat. That is also broken up into about 8 different subcommittees that the center has a seat in each one of those subcommittees. Some are around training, some are around gun legislature, courts, the fatality review, in which every single domestic violence homicide is reviewed. And we also, that is a huge group of individuals. I know that some of you on this are at the table with that, to really start to drill down and look at root causes and what are we missing. I hope that before I retire, we have a much stronger community response around these families, and bring in the high risk model, which I'll mention briefly, so we can start preventing these domestic violence situations. The benefits, of course, increased likelihood of early detection, reduced risk of re-victimization, and reduced chance that families will fall through the cracks. And that is one of the biggest pieces. Out of the 20 homicides that have occurred in our 9-county service area in 2022, only 3 people had ever reached out to us. And the last time they reached out was several years ago. These families have fallen through the crack. There's a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of misnomers around EPOs. Had a conversation after Angelica James's horrible murder and her son was shot. Her father reached out to us and had conversation. And he said, I thought she did everything. There is the belief, unfortunately, that an emergency protective order is kind of this, as somebody said, this kind of fierce, this force that protects people. Unfortunately, it's not. What it does is it begins the paper trail, the legal trail. It does mean that if this person shows up and police are called immediately, they can arrest the individual. But it's not a blanket protection that I can go about my life as it normally was because I have an EPO. That's not what it means, and that's why safety planning is essential. And trying to keep these families from falling through the cracks. So some strategies for prevention. One of them is the Children's Hospital Philadelphia Center for Violence Prevention. They have an intimate partner prevention. It's called Stop IPV. So when children come into the emergency room at CHOP and there is any red flag at all that there may be some physical abuse going on, then an IPV assessment is done. And what I'm reading is that it's actually done more frequently. It's almost a given. Just like we ask kids kids that are old enough to answer questions, we may have guardian or parent step out of the room and ask them questions. Are you safe at home? And kind of do a screening around that. There should also be IPV screenings. We can never assume that is not happening. One of the other signs that I didn't mention on here, but I will talk about an ordinance in Louisville now, is around animal abuse. Animal abuse is another big red flag. If children share that animal abuse is occurring, it's oftentimes a result of family violence because animals are used as another intimidation weapon. It's also, if perpetrators are abusing the animals, it's a sign of, see, this is what I can do to you. We take animals here at the shelter when victims come to the center, because we obviously know that can be a deterrent while they come. And so it's really important that they know that they can bring their animal and they can stay with us. We have a partnership with the Kentucky Humane Society that we don't want the animals to stay in cages for more than 24 hours. And so if the individuals that are here cannot find another place, we have a partnership that they can go to a foster home with the Kentucky Humane Society. In 2019, nearly 30,000 patient caregivers were screened for IPE at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia. So, I don't want to go over our time, but an amazing model, something to really take a look at and to do some research on at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia. One of the other models is the Missouri Mental Health Infant and Early Childhood Visiting Model. And I've also seen this model over in South Carolina and some other states in which home visiting programs are working with pregnant moms right after they've given birth, and early childhood home visiting. And they are also assessing for domestic intimate partner violence and having those conversations. In the intimate partner violence screening, 99.3 caregivers enrolled in home visiting were screened for IPE within 6 months of their enrollment. And again, beginning to bring in resources, having those conversations. Obviously, you wouldn't do that in the home if there's any safety risk. And so that's something that needs to be assessed before going into the home, is who's there, and having the conversations around, is this safe? This is an absolutely model program. We've been having some conversations around how can we bring some of this to Kentucky. I know that there's some folks in Kentucky that went to Safe and Together Institute, which is in Canton, Connecticut. They treat the family as a whole. A model I would love to see us move towards. It's about keeping children safe and together with the non-offending parent. Because again, oftentimes what happens is the children get abused because the non-offending parent can't protect them. And so what we do is we hold the victim accountable for the fact that the children are being abused. We're not holding the perpetrator necessarily accountable. And now the children are placed or removed from the home. What would it look like if we could treat everybody together, with the non-offending parent being out, holding them accountable, but provide the services, the therapy, all of that pieces to the entire family, and keep families together? It would just be absolutely amazing. So again, Safe and Together Institute in Canton, Connecticut. Please go on their website. They do some amazing work. Like I said, they've come to Kentucky to do some work, and they're doing it all over the country. I listed my references here. So this is the ordinance I wanted to share with you all. It passed, Metro Council passed it last year. This is the animal abuse and family violence. And the way this works is, when an animal abuse call comes in to Metro Animal Services, when they go out and do an assessment of animal abuse, they are also being trained to do an assessment for family violence, because they know that they go hand in hand. They're obviously mandated reporters for child abuse, but also being able to link the families up with services in the community. I don't know how well it's going yet. I know there's some real specific training requirements that we're going to be put in place. And I'm not really sure how that is working yet. I'll be anxious to see. One of the other Kentucky mandating reporting laws is KRS 209. So this has to do with protecting vulnerable adults. So an abuse or neglect of an adult who has a mental or physical disability is unable to protect themselves. This might include an elderly person. These reports oftentimes go to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So this can be an individual that is getting abused by their partner who has a mental or physical disability, someone who's in a wheelchair, can't protect themselves and is being abused, or has a mental health diagnosis. Maybe they've already suffered a traumatic brain injury and is being abused by their partner. One of the things that some folks don't realize, and this came up when the animal abuse ordinance was being drafted, had a lot of conversations around this. Up until 2017, Kentucky had a mandated domestic violence reporting law, meaning that if someone was aware that there was domestic violence going on between two individuals, we were mandated to report that to law officials. That got reversed in 2017. And the reason that it got reversed is because it wasn't helping. One of our philosophies here, and we see it over and over again, and it's very true, is that victims know best what victims need. The time for a victim to leave, and leaving is not an event, it is a process. It's a process that takes a lot of time and a lot of planning. Because again, if they haven't had any access to money, how are they going to leave? Where are they going to go? And so maybe they've been stocking away money. Maybe they've been going to classes when their perpetrator has been away at work and they're taking online classes to have a vocation. And so it's a process. And so one of the things that's very important is that when that time comes for them to leave, that they can leave safely. And by reporting this outside of the survivor's wishes and understanding all of the dynamics, because domestic violence is so complex, it often puts the whole family at risk. Again, remember, it's about power and control. And so if the perpetrator feels like they're losing that power and control, they're going to grasp it even tighter to the point of death. If I can't have you, nobody can have you. If these children can't be with me, then nobody can have these children. And unfortunately, we know too many horrible stories. So I'm going to wrap up with some important numbers I want you all to make sure and have. I know you have the child abuse hotlines, but I also want you to make sure that you have our hotline numbers as well as the National Domestic Violence hotline numbers. And so thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to educate you on domestic violence. Maybe you learned something that you didn't know, but please feel free to reach out, ask questions, get more information, post information. Again, when you look at the statistics that so many women and men are experiencing domestic intimate partner violence, we know that so many children are victims to it in a variety of ways. So again, thank you so much. And I will stop sharing. McKenna.
Thank you so much. That was just incredibly powerful information. And thankfully, it sounds like some promising programs potentially along a prevention route, or at least a screening route to get folks assistance before things escalate.
Definitely.
Even further. I think all of us who've worked in this area have some sense that violence doesn't occur in silos, right? And so oftentimes our efforts in the community work in silos. And so I think the more we can cross talk and work together, the more effective we're going to be. So
absolutely.
I really appreciate you being here. I think there was one question in the chat. When you're talking about LMPD's involvement, is this the crisis intervention team, or is there another special team with LMPD that's assigned to these type of cases?
So it is, so the way when I talk about LMPD, what it is, the way it's supposed to work is that when a domestic violence call, intimate partner violence call comes into dispatch, 911, perpetrators trying to get through the door, or this has just happened. The officer goes out and does the run. They are to complete a lethality screening assessment to determine, again, where does this person rank? Are they in a lethal situation? Or are they not? And even if they're not, the plan is that they're to give them our information and encourage them to connect with us. And then it does get gets handed over to the domestic violence unit. I know that when Chief Shields came on, she made some changes to that unit. And my understanding is she's adding more officers back to that unit because she actually took some out and reassigned them. But we need more boots around domestic violence specifically. So it's not the crisis intervention team. It is frontline officers.
Great. If you have any additional questions, throw them in the Q&A or unmute if that's a choice.
And I'm happy for I don't think I shared my information on here, but please feel free. I can put my email address in the chat. You are more than welcome to reach out to me. It's a long one.
No, thanks for sharing it.
Absolutely.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A percolating, so oh, yes, I do. Do you ever see situations where the domestic violence is coming from and received by both partners? For example, what if one partner is psychologically controlling / manipulative and the other acts physically? How is it best to approach these situations?
So we have where family violence it's kind of coming from everywhere. The best way to approach it is obviously if we can get one individual to the shelter or to some type of services, and we can start working with them and try to get somebody else to some services, but separating the two adults obviously putting the children with either a safe relative, or if depending upon if the physically aggressive parent can seek some services. Because one of the things that we know that happens, and we see this here, there's a lot of trauma, and trauma acting out oftentimes comes out as a lot of anger, and a lot of behaviors that are not acceptable. And so we have those conversations here as well. And we see that. We have people who come into shelter, and they're angry and they're hurting, and they're tired, and they're abusive to our staff. And we just have to say, well, wait a minute, let's back up, let's take a deep breath, let's talk about appropriate behavior. And we have a lot of those conversations around that. And again, around parenting, intervening. My office windows face the courtyard, which is kind of the playground. And so I can often hear things. And when I hear a parent behaving in a very non-caring way, I will step out and just say, hey, what's going on? And they'll say, I'm stressed, he's not doing this. And we'll just have a good conversation, because what they need to know is, yes, this has been hard and I'm not handling this well, but I'm supported in there and I'm going to get some resources. So I think starting those conversations and finding out what people need. I mean, and of course, sometimes they don't even know what they need, but let me connect you to a place that can help you figure that out. Was there another question?
Great.
Okay.
I guess we'll take one more question. So how do you deal with domestic violence when both partners are violent? However, one partner is violent in self-defense. How do the authorities deal with these situations when it's he said, she said?
Oftentimes in these situations, most of the time, you've got a history. This isn't just a one-time thing. When police or other folks get involved. And so once we gather some history and we find out that one adult has had a history of being emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive, doing all of those things, then again, we're going to separate them and talk about an emergency protective order. Sometimes they'll take EPOs out on each other. That's not uncommon. Sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes it's kind of a tit for tat thing. And we just encourage them to separate and to start getting some services, getting therapy, doing some things. And maybe this relationship can't be salvaged, but let's focus on the kids. If you've got kids involved in these situations, let's focus on what's in their best interest. But yeah, I mean, I think that's not uncommon. Obviously, if somebody's being hit, they're going to defend themselves. They're going to do what they need to do to protect themselves and to protect their kids. I do know of a situation because this person called me and said, I've just been arrested because I pulled a gun on my husband who was beating my son. What do I do? And so once she got out, I said, come here, let's get you some services. And let's talk about that. And she was never charged. It was just officer walked in, got the call. Teenage boy had gotten in a physical fight with dad. Mom was standing there with a gun, so it looked pretty bad. But once the officers and the detectives did their investigation, they realized she was protecting her son. Dad had the son down on the couch with his hands around his throat. And she said, I was going to shoot him. And so that does happen. One of the other home incarceration situations that occurred a couple of years ago was a woman who long horrific history of abuse, both she and her children, and her abuser was on home incarceration, and he cut off his ankle and ankle bracelet, and she got a call that he had gone AWOL. She registered herself for the VINE system, the Victim Information Network, and she got a call that he got gone AWOL. She didn't know what that meant, so she called the detective, and he said that means he's on the run. She was waiting for him. He busted through her door, and she was sitting there with a gun, and she killed him. And when the officers came, she was sitting on the front porch, and they said, what happened? And she said, his body's in there, my gun's on the table. And when they left, she said, are you not going to arrest me? And he said, no, you were defending yourself. You saved your life. And so that does happen. And the more that we do training with LMPD to have those conversations, to understand why is the victim sitting there with a gun, with a knife, whatever. Yeah, they're protecting themselves. That's what they need to do. But yeah, making sure you have those conversations and you do your due diligence. Long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
Well, it's very complex. Well, thanks
It
again
is.
for being with us. I hope we'll continue these conversations going forward.